What's up, guys? JJ here with another late round podcast rewind. Hopefully you can't hear my daughter in the background, but I hope you're doing well. I hope you're staying safe, and I hope that you're washing your hands. Last year, I brought draft analyst Anthony Amico on to talk about prospecting through data. Anthony and I talked about why numbers matter when evaluating prospects, and then he gave some insight on some of the data points that he looks at when he's scouting. Now, the show today does abruptly end. You'll hear that in a second, because I asked Anthony questions about last year's draft class, which clearly isn't relevant today. But I think there's a lot of good information from this show. I like bringing on guests during the offseason who scout in different ways because it's a process where there aren't any defined answers. And listening to how other people do things may be able to help you in the way that you're viewing certain prospects. So without further ado, here's the first large chunk of the interview with Anthony. And for any of you not following him on Twitter, you can find him at Amicsta. That's Amicsta. Enjoy the interview, and I'll be back in your ears on Friday with the weekly mailbag show. All right, let's start by getting a little bit philosophical. Why do you think so many scouts are against heavily weighing production when prospecting wide receivers and running backs? Like, why does the eye test have to mean absolutely everything to them?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think the heart of it is like it's just like anything else, right? Like you put a lot of time into something and you want your work to be meaningful. I mean, like, I can't imagine the man hours it takes to grind all that tape, to have to do all that. And then, you go online and people are telling you like what you're doing maybe doesn't matter because like I can do X, Y, or Z and that's maybe quicker or better. So it puts you in a spot to like have to anchor and defend your work instead of maybe being like open to the new research. So I think, if you're looking at all that nuance all the time and that's the basis for your takes, the idea that you can like click a few buttons or something and look at some numbers probably seems a little weird. And it probably doesn't help that maybe some of us in the numbers community take things a little too far in terms of propagating the value of numbers versus the film. I mean, I'm definitely strongly in the camp that both matter. I think you probably are too. Yeah. And it's, we end up having these like weird holy wars on Twitter because like everyone just wants to like make sure that their stuff matters. But,
Right. Yeah. Part of me thinks too that like the approach that numbers driven analysts take, given the fact that like, let's just look at the last 15 or 20 years as analytics have gotten bigger and bigger. It's almost like folks who are into numbers and are prospecting via numbers, we might be able to go about it in a little bit more of a gentle way, right? Like we're there, and I'm not saying you or me necessarily. I just mean the community in general, where we discover something, and instead of being understanding and a little bit more empathetic as to what the other side has done for the past 50 years, looking at these guys via film, I think that we can approach it in a way where it doesn't have to be such an attack. It can be. It can come from a place where we're saying, numbers can help, right? It doesn't. We're not saying that what is being done is a horrible thing. We're saying that here's some added information to make prospecting a little bit more accurate.
Absolutely, and like I feel as though in football in particular, but like in a lot of sports, like people are just resistant to things that are like outside of the realm of the sport. I mean, like people don't even really hire like coaches if they haven't played the sport before, right? Let alone listen to analysts about like how to draft prospects.
Yeah. I mean, there have been many times in my mentions people saying, have you ever even played football before? So I definitely feel that. So Anthony, you've been working on your prospect models for some time now. Can you sort of talk through your approach in building those models and sort of how you've improved the model over the last year or so?
Yeah. So, I mean, at first, just obviously just looking for some answers. I mean, the draft is probably my favorite sporting event of the whole year. But figuring out who's going to be like hashtag good and who's taking fantasy drafts is pretty tough. So I started trying to build, like a simple linear regression model using some statistics to predict a player's best PPR season within their first 3 years. I chose that marker just because I felt like, at least in terms of dynasty, like if a player's good and he doesn't do it, if he does something good for fantasy, if he doesn't do it within those first 3 years, it's very likely that that player is no longer on the roster of the team that drafted him. So I thought like that early success was really important. Like we were saying before, the film versus stats thing always pops up. So I was kind of like, there has to be a way to maybe quantify like what the game watchers are seeing, even if they're not quantifying it for us. So I just looked at, I just started adding draft scout rankings to my models from NFL Draft Scout. And, big gains were seen in predictiveness. Even bigger gains were seen when I started taking the log of those ranks, not to get like too into the weeds, but rankings are obviously like very linear. Like the difference between, 9 and 10 is the difference between 99 and 100. But with logs, it's, the difference between 1 and 10 is the same as the difference between 10 and 100. So it like more highly values the players that we would consider to be really good. And that ended up proving to be valuable as well. So those differences have been big. Over the last year or so, I've changed up the statistics in those models. We'll probably talk a little bit about that later in the show. But I've also just used some different approaches outside of like, your basic R-squared hunting, as I'll sometimes call it. I've done some threshold testing to see where certain stats matter and how much. And most recently, I've used logistic regression to come up with some probabilities of player success at the next level to give us probably a little bit better of a picture of maybe how likely it is that these players are going to hit for us.
Yeah, so you mentioned the scout rankings as an input in this model. I'm assuming the scout rankings standalone are not as good as this model, or as good as what the model would say, meaning the data that you're inputting alongside with the scout rankings is really what's doing it for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the scout rankings give us a really good baseline to work with, and then we're adding, a couple of those key stats that are, driving our success even higher.
Right. So what are some of the statistics that you found to sort of be worthwhile when you're looking at running backs? And then have you found that there are things that you think that people just tend to overrate from a statistical standpoint?
Yeah, running back, the stats that I found matter the most have been breakout age, which for me is the age a back hits 130 or more adjusted all-purpose yards per game. Just kind of a number that I picked arbitrarily, but through testing it was working. Final year scrimmage yards per game, and final year yards per scrimmage play, which is something I was just talking to you about, a couple weeks ago.
Yeah.
That proved to be probably the most important out of all those. Gives us again like that nice blend of share in the offense, but also efficiency. In terms of what I think people are overrating, yards per carry, I think is probably overused. Market share of team rush attempts, not necessarily rush yards, but just the attempts. And obviously, like all the raw statistics in the rushing department. I think that's probably the biggest misconception in production-based analysis. Like you start talking about it, people bring up, look at this guy who had all these rushing yards and he was terrible. But that's not really what it's about. I mean, I think that if you're just looking at those raw numbers, you're probably not going to find a ton of things that are useful.
Yeah, that's really interesting. The attempt share is really interesting. I mean, I've seen it matter to a degree, but I've also found that sheer volume just seems to matter more. We're trying to look at how these running backs looked from an attempt standpoint within their offense, obviously, when we're looking at things like market share of rushing attempts, but it just seems like the overall the amount of workload that these players are getting just seems to matter more.
Yeah, like raw rush attempts per game was much more valuable just because, I mean, the ability to carry a heavy workload, I think, is a skill. Mm-hmm. And, if you demonstrate that skill in college, it's likely that you could do that at the next level.
Yeah, and I wonder if you could also even look at it from the perspective of if you have a really good running back on your team and he's going to get more volume regardless of what that offense looks like. So if let's say it's a very pass-first offense, well, if you have this game-changing running back, you're probably going to change that offense for that running back, right?
For sure.
So I think that's another reason why maybe the market share numbers didn't look as good as the overall volume. That's really interesting, though. But I'll ask the same for wide receivers. What are sort of some of the worthwhile stats that you've seen that seem to work with wide receivers in their transition to the NFL, and then maybe some numbers that folks tend to overvalue?
Yeah, I mean, I know you've talked about this before on this show, but receiving yards per team pass attempt is fantastic. I mean, it gives you the blend of market share and efficiency. I think that those things matter probably a little bit more at receiver than they do at running back. Breakout age, again, important. That's, for me, age that a player makes a 30% dominator, so the share of receiving yards and touchdowns. Market share of receiving yards on its own is pretty powerful. As is receiving touchdowns per team pass attempt. So breaking it down per team pass attempt definitely proved to be valuable. But some of these bigger share numbers obviously do matter. And then the overrated statistics, I mean, it's similar to running back. I mean, like the raw efficiency, like yards per reception, not incredibly important. I mean, if you're breaking it down and you find like this group of really efficient receivers, like maybe that's valuable if they don't meet some other thresholds, but certainly you want to hit some other numbers before you get to that raw efficiency. And I kind of think that we may overrate total dominator too much. So again, like that average of receiving yardage share and touchdown share, like I think like there's thresholds that you want to hit, but I think too often maybe we look at somebody that has like a 40% dominator and we look at someone who has a 35% dominator and we say, oh, well, the first player is like definitely better. But I think really as long as you're hitting some kind of minimum, that stuff ends up being like a little noisy once you get past like certain numbers.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. The other thing too about Dominator that I haven't really talked that much about on this show for whatever reason is that I tend to find more success by breaking up the statistics and the market share numbers instead of combining them like Dominator does. You know, it just gives you a better idea of what that wide receiver sort of did. I mean, you can look at reception share versus yardage share and just find a difference there and just sort of get a feel for what that, not that that's predictive, but to just get a little feel of what that wide receiver did. And then on top of that, I found that standalone, and to your point, you talked about this as well, standalone touchdown numbers are really, really important. And the fact that combined with yardage is really what is bringing together with Dominator. When you're able to separate that, you can see there are certain players who might not have crazy good yardage marks, but they're able to make that jump because their touchdown numbers are just so out of control, or vice versa.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, you want to know what makes these players good. I mean, a guy like, you don't want to compare a guy like a David Sills to a guy like, I don't know, like N'Keal Harry or someone. Like, just like their dominators might end up being like relatively close, but like Sills is scoring like tons and tons and tons of touchdowns. And, Harry is accumulating a ton of yards in his offense. Yeah.
Have you found that any of this is different for tight ends? I do a lot less prospecting with tight ends. It's just not something that I've really jumped into quite yet. So I'm curious as your thoughts on that.
Yeah, definitely haven't been as extensive with the tight ends like you were saying, but a lot of the stuff that I've looked at has actually said that just getting the ball is predictive of success. So like receptions per game, whether it's final season or career, like those are the numbers that pop the most for me. So it just seems like if your college offense is throwing to the tight end at all at like a decent rate, like that means the guy's probably pretty good.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm going to switch gears a little bit and ask something that's not necessarily related to just the statistics and the box score scouting. But is the combine meaningful? Have you found that there's any meaning there within your models?
Yeah, I think the combine is really meaningful. I mean, athleticism, speed score in particular is like really important for running backs. Like that's actually in my running back model.
Same.
But even just like aside from the models, and I think without doing too much testing of it, I do think that athleticism probably matters a lot at tight end. Samples are a little harder to get there, but even if the athleticism is not popping in a lot of the models, otherwise, like I've just looked at some of the stuff with Spark, and like you want guys to hit like some minimum thresholds. Like it may not be important to run like a 4.3, but like if you're trying to draft a receiver that runs like a 4.9, I'm obviously being excessive, but like that's a problem, right? Like you want guys to hit minimum levels of athleticism, in some way. I mean, this is using Spark, but like just looking at the Spark stuff, like if you hit a couple minimum thresholds, like your success rate does go way up. It's just that like reaching the ends of the ranges isn't really important. You just have to be like above replacement or above a certain level. And I think that makes sense considering, these guys are entering the most athletic league in the sport that they play.
Right. Yeah, no, it absolutely makes sense. I mean, when Elijah Holyfield did what he did in the 40, I think that there's a lot of reason for people to freak out. It makes a lot of sense to freak out at that bad of a 40-yard dash, whereas someone like David Montgomery, he runs his slower than what we would want from a top back in the class, but at least we've seen successes within that range before.
Definitely.